Hello, welcome. We'll give everyone a chance to just come on into our room. We're so glad you're here this evening. Welcome to Special Education for Formed Families, Making It Work. Welcome, welcome. I'm Kelly Henderson with Formed Families Forward, and I'm joined by Beth Spivak, who is going to take us down the next couple slides to get us started this evening. Welcome.
Yeah, so thank you for being here. So I think, so the goals for this evening are, or the learning intentions, I should say, are that participants will be able to name who in foster, adoptive, and kinship families can request and provide consent for reevaluation, identify disability categories under which many children and youth in foster, adoptive, and kinship families are eligible, distinguish the impact of pre-placement delays and challenges from disabilities requiring special education and related services, and explore trauma-sensitive assessment and evaluation approaches that result in stronger, more accurate identification of disabilities for children and youth in foster, adoptive, and kinship families. So those are our learning intentions for this evening. And we're going to just go over some quick housekeeping. So you can use the questions pods, to post questions and comments, and others will not see your questions and comments. You can download the handouts from the pod, and all recording slides and handouts will be on the FFF's website under resources, webinars by Thursday. And email info@formedfamiliesforward.org if you need a certificate of attendance. So if you have any questions about that, I think Kelly is going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, then chat that in. And I am Beth Spivak, the Family Support and Outreach Director at Formed Families Forward. I'll let Kelly introduce herself. I think you're muted.
Thanks. I'm Kelly Henderson. I direct Formed Families Forward. It's an honor and privilege to do so. And I am a parent of 3 kiddos, 3 sons, 2 of whom joined our family through foster care adoption, and all of whom received specialized services or did when they were in school. And I still have 1 in high school. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here. And Beth, I think, is going to tell you a little bit more about what we do.
Yeah, so at Formed Families Forward, we are a family-led resource center in Northern Virginia supporting foster, adoptive, and kinship families who are raising children, youth, and young adults with special needs and professionals who work with our families. We offer free training, consultations to families, event resources, and systems navigation. Also, we have peer support groups. We have an excellent resource directory. And we have Learning Your Way, self-paced classes, videos, and other resources. And we are the family partner to Virginia Tiered Systems of Support, which is a VDOE project. And you have my email address as well as Kelly's email address if you have any questions or would like additional information. So with that, I think I can do this last slide too. So this was a 4-part series, accessing special education, and we are on part 8, special education, making it work for formed families. And then on March 15th, the last webinar in this series will be connecting to special education services for military families formed through adoption, kinship care, and foster care. So that's going to be really good as well.
Thanks, Beth. And if you joined us for those earlier webinars, we're so thrilled you're back. We are going to touch on a little bit of the evaluation and eligibility basics and reevaluation, but we're really going to focus on issues that are more specific to foster, adoptive, and kinship families tonight. And if you didn't have the opportunity to see those and want to see those and get a deeper dive into evaluation and reevaluation, all of those previous webinars, as well as many, many other webinars, are on our website. If you go anytime, you can access those as well as the handouts. One other exciting event that I really want to encourage folks to consider, if you're a foster, adoptive, or kinship family, or you're a professional that works with our families, is our Spring Forward Family Fun Day. This is our annual event. We have not had it in person for the last 2 years. This last time was 2019. So we are really, really excited about being back in person, in connection directly with other family members. It is designed for the whole family. There are children's activities. There's nursery care for the little ones. The children are out on a wonderful adventure course, outside, climbing, running, playing, balancing, all kinds of good things. And parents, caregivers, and professionals are inside at George Mason Manassas campus learning and connecting. We have a fabulous workshop. It is designed for professionals, but families are welcome, and that's focused on trauma and resiliency with a very well-known trauma expert, Dr. Allison Jackson Dwyer will be joining us. And then we have a bunch of breakouts and a wonderful keynote. We're just really excited about the day. So please consider registering. I believe that Beth is going to place that in the chat. So you should be able to get that link directly from the chat box. I wanted to mention, you all probably can't type in the chat box the way this particular webinar is set up, but you can type into the questions pod. So probably on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a pod that says questions with a little arrow. Just click on that and you can chat your questions in. So again, welcome. So glad you're here. Want to know a little bit more about you as we get started. So I'm going to launch a poll. If you could just respond quickly, we will find out a little bit more about you. And you can mark more than one, because we know that many of us form our families in many ways and play more than one role in the community. If none of these fit you, you're welcome to put your role in the questions pod. It says chat, but put it in the questions pod. So just click on the responses that apply. We're going to give you about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to wrap that up and close it in 3, 2, 1. All right, and I'm going to hopefully share the results there. Beth, can you read those results to us?
I can. So 33% are foster parents, 56% are adoptive parents, 11% are kinship caregivers. There are 33% who are birth parents, and 56% educational social services or mental health professionals. So there's a nice range of people here.
Awesome. That's great. We're so glad you're here. And we're going to talk a little bit again about the basics and then get into more of the specifics about what really matters and can be helpful to foster, adoptive, and kinship families who are raising kiddos with special needs. So many of you know there are these formal supports, the options in our policy and procedures in the United States and in Virginia. First of all, there are a couple big federal pieces of legislation, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and specifically Section 504 within that provides for accommodations. And in school, that looks like a 504 plan, where accommodations and modifications are laid out for an individual with a disability defined as a major life activity is impacted by impairment. A sort of newer version of those protections, which applied initially only to federally funded programs, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed initially in 1990, and that was extending the protections of the Rehabilitation Act to all public accommodations, meaning privately held businesses, et cetera. So not just federally funded. And then there's specialized instruction, and this is really what we're going to focus on tonight, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, often is synonymous with special education, and that really is a distinction between those other accommodations and modifications that are provided in schools under the Section 504 plan. The services and supports, the program of specialized instruction for kiddos with disabilities who are eligible under IDEA is documented in an IEP, an individualized education program. And then there are services and supports through other systems. If you're a foster adoptive parent, a social services professional, you know some of those systems. There's a public mental health system, there's social service systems, there's there's disability supports, all kinds of support systems that are important to our families. But our focus tonight really is talking a little bit more deeply about that Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which guarantees, and that initially passed in 1975. So it's been around a while and it's evolved a bit, but it has been a really core and foundational protection and right for individuals with disabilities who are in school or who are younger. So it is a guarantee to a free, appropriate public education, and it is specially designed instruction. I talked about the difference between 504 and IEP. This specially designed instruction is a really key phrase. It means that something is uniquely different about the instruction that this child is needing. And so it is a fundamental core principle that something unique is necessary for this child to be able to access and benefit from education. There's also a presumption of placement in the least restrictive environment. Sometimes we call that LRE, and that's the idea that a child is going to be educated in their neighborhood school, in their regular education, general education class with their typically developing peers as much as possible. And then finally, there's a really important guarantee about parent participation in educational planning. Families, unlike other provisions like Title I, are integrally involved in the education planning for a child with a disability under IDEA. There's a little asterisk there for parent, and I just want to clarify that parent, as the feds define it, we're going to talk a lot about the definition of parent in a moment in the Virginia regs, but it is considered to be an inclusive term, to be the parental educational decision maker, the person who is serving in that role. So who gets special education services? Well, you have to be eligible. And that's really been the focus of this series of webinars, is an evaluation eligibility process. I'm just doing a quick check to make sure we don't have any questions. Okay. And to become eligible, the child must meet a criteria of one or more of the federal disability categories. And again, we're going to cover this a little bit more detail and has been covered in those previous webinars if you want a really deep dive. And you must demonstrate a need for special education and related services. So not only do you have to have the disability, but there's that need for that specialized instruction, something different than is being provided other kiddos. So we're going to move to a poll. We're moving you fast. We're making you work here tonight. We're going to do a poll on what services you have, or the children in your care have accessed. Whoops, there we go. Beth, is that showing?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So if you can click again, you can click more than one. So we're talking about a child that's been in your care, a child that's in your care, or a child you've worked with. Oh, you know what? I have a feeling because I clicked it and I'm not getting responses. So I apologize for that. I think I must have clicked too fast. Even though you see it, I don't think I can accept any. Let me see. Yeah, sorry, it's not gonna let me do that. Well, let me go back to my slides. Okay, we're just going to skip that slide, but if you have some experience with IEPs, you have 504 plan experience, just put that in the questions pod and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. Apologize about that. We'd love to know your experience, and we will have a chance at the end to hear more about your experiences. Are you seeing my screen?
Yep. Yeah, it's still the poll.
Oh, that's not what I want. How about now?
So just go, you're at poll 2, so just go one forward. There you go.
All right. So again, special education is that set of specialized services. It is federal legislation, and it is implemented through state regulations. And as I said, it does guarantee that right to a free, appropriate education. What is a parent? In IDA's view, it is this, and this is straight from the Virginia Special Education Regulations. It is first a biological or adoptive parent of the child. So that is our first presumption. So if there is a biological parent involved and termination of parental rights has not happened, if it's a case of a child who may be in public care, that biological parent or the adoptive parent has that right of parent, of educational decision maker as a parent, is assumed to be that person. But then, if that person is not able to act, or that person does not exist, then a foster parent, even if the biological or adoptive parent's rights have not been terminated, is entitled to serve in this role again if that biological parent is not attempting to act as parent. Okay, so I'm going to clarify that again. If the biological parent is not acting as parent, they're unavailable or unwilling to act as parent, or there's been a termination of parental rights, then the foster parent is presumed to be the next designee, the next person who can serve as educational decision maker under IDEA. I know that may not be applicable in all domains, healthcare, etc., but it is true for educational decision maker. And I'm just taking a pause to look at those who did take time to respond in the questions pod. Yeah, I know there's no place to check. I'm sorry about that. So a couple haven't been referred yet. Child has an IEP, IEP. So we do have some folks who are familiar with the IEP process. So that's wonderful. You are our experts as well. And then the list continues down in the regulations in Virginia. If biological parent, adoptive parent can't serve, foster parent is not available, then a guardian, generally authorized to act as the child's parent or authorized to make educational decisions for the child. Then it goes to an individual acting in the place of a biological or adoptive parent, and that could include, they specifically identify kin or step parent or other relatives. And then if none of the above can serve, a surrogate parent is appointed. And the surrogates are used somewhat in Virginia, not so much up here in Northern Virginia quite as much, but it is a point of process that could be employed. And then an emancipated minor. So all of those in that order are those who can serve as parent or as a parent educational decision maker in IDEA. You will note that there is this option where a judicial decree, basically a court, can trump that order of priority for who can serve. That rarely happens, but it is obviously the court's prerogative to do so. So again, as we go, if you have questions, chat them in and we can address them at a later time in this webinar. Other references to foster parents in the law. This is interesting since we are talking about evaluation. It is important to know that schools do not need initial evaluation consent for wards of the state if reasonable efforts have been made to either figure out who the parent is or get consent from that birth parent. Okay, but if push comes to shove and they can't get that consent, they can't find the parent, then they can move ahead without consent for initial evaluation. That is only for children who are in foster care, who are in care of this ward of the state. And then a written notice still must be sent to biological parents, even if the child is living with a foster parent, if those parents, biological or adoptive parents, rights have not been terminated. And that's for IEP or eligibility meetings. Okay. If you were in our earlier sessions, you know about the special education cycle. If you've lived this, you know about the special education cycle. And just briefly, we sort of start at the upper right, referral, somebody believes that there's reason for concern that the child may have some delays or disability, and there's a process for making a referral that moves to evaluation. There's a lot of process for evaluation we'll talk about, then moves to eligibility. IEPs is formed as a result of collection of data about the child, and they set goals in that IEP. Then there's instruction and monitoring, and at least annually the IEP is reviewed, and periodically reevaluation occurs. And again, we had a webinar specifically on reevaluation. Okay, and I see, Melissa, I see your question, and I will get to it when we get towards the end and have time for questions. I don't think you're alone in that question, so we'll get there. All right. So we're going to talk just for a bit about evaluation. So in evaluation, we are looking at areas of suspected disability, and these are the array of things when a child is evaluated to determine whether they are a child with a disability. And you can see it's quite an array of areas of evaluation, areas of assessment. Health assessment, vision assessment, hearing must be done initially in all cases, regardless of what the suspected disability may be. Social emotional status, general intelligence, sometimes we call that ability testing, or cognitive ability, academic performance, communicative status, motor abilities, adaptive behaviors, and it may include additional educational assessments. Usually those are, types of achievement tests, medical, social, cultural, psychological, or developmental assessments. And there's a lot of, all of these data are collected, there's a lot of protections in the law and regulations to ensure that that data is representative, is accurate, is reliably collected. And so these are just some of the provisions that the regulations lay out to ensure that your child is being evaluated correctly and clearly and in a non-biased way. So I'm not going to read them all. There's a lot here. Suffice it to say, there's a big focus on making sure that those are not biased, that the tests are being used for the purpose in which they were developed, so valid, they have high validity, they have high reliability, and the people delivering those or administering those tests are highly qualified. So this is one I do want to pause on for just a moment because we're talking with foster, adoptive, and kinship families who often are raising kiddos who have trauma histories or unique experiences in their history that may be somewhat atypical. So I want you to know that there are ways to assess that may be more trauma sensitive. There may be tools that have been used to assess or evaluate your child that are not perhaps the standard condition exactly as the test manufacturer identified, and that's okay. You can still, the team can still consider those results, even if they were not conducted under standard condition. It just needs to be clearly described in the evaluation report how those were done. If a non-standardized assessment is used, they still need to be performed by a qualified personnel. Want to make sure, again, that the assessment is comprehensive enough to identify all of the child's special education needs and related services needs, whether or not that it's been commonly linked to the disability category in which the child has been classified. So this is an important one. So if your kiddo comes to you through adoption or foster care or kinship, and they already have an IEP and they have an eligibility report in their file that says autism, let's just say, and you are in getting to know the child and raising the child, you're beginning to feel that there may be some other issues in addition to autism or instead of autism that would explain some of the autistic-like behaviors. It is absolutely okay and clearly here, stated here, important to collect data in the reevaluation or initial evaluation that looks at all areas of the child's needs and doesn't limit the data collection to just the category that he or she has already been identified under. No single measure to ever be used. And then once the data has been collected, it is a group, a team of persons who look at that data to determine whether there is a disability afoot. And now, Beth's going to talk a little bit about the trauma lens over top of this evaluation process.
Yeah, so trauma-informed assessments and evaluations are clearly really significant for the kids that we're talking about, because some or many of them do have trauma histories. So trauma-focused assessments, those target processes to determine the presence of traumatic events, experience, and effects. So for example, trauma screenings and trauma-informed assessments, those would apply a trauma lens to all existing assessment processes, including those solely focused on academics. So for example, trauma-informed functional behavioral assessments can be used, and also trauma-informed family engagement and report writing. So using language carefully and trying not to trigger anyone during this process, especially the kiddos. So we're going to talk about sharing information for a while, and the reasons why sharing information is generally a good idea. So in the social cultural assessment, first of all, consent is needed for that assessment. And the information in that assessment is private and will not be shared with other students or parents. So I know sometimes people get nervous about sharing information, and I really actually should start this by saying, we talked about this in one of the other webinars, but I think it'd be helpful if I actually explained that the social cultural assessment describes family history, structure, and dynamics. It talks about developmental and health history, and it has social and adaptive behavior in the home, school, and community. So it really is a way for the school to get to know the child and the family. So they are really generally pretty helpful. So the information that you have to share is obviously going to be really dependent on your historical knowledge of the child, such as the child's birth history, or even how long the child's been in your home. I mean, we know for adoptive children and foster children and kinship children, we may not even know their birth histories. So you might want to get input from the birth family when possible, or even like former foster parents, case managers, or mental health professionals that are familiar with the child. And again, this information does give the school insight from the family, from your perspective, of the places that the child is living now, about the student's struggles and strengths in the home and the community. And in conjunction with other assessments, it may provide evidence for the need for special education services. And just remember, the school doesn't have a full picture of the child unless you share information. So for instance, homework might be an issue at the home if a child has a diagnosis of ADHD and takes medication to control symptoms. But if the medication runs out, then the child can't do homework. Well, the school doesn't know that unless you tell them that. Or if the child has experienced a traumatic event that adversely impacts behavior at school, the school doesn't know that either unless you tell them that. So the school may interpret the behavior as being intentional when the child is really just dysregulated or in survival mode. So having that knowledge can help the school interact with the child in a trauma-sensitive way to eliminate or cut down triggers. So next slide. Yeah. So sharing personal information during the referral and assessment process for special education. So you can make a referral if you feel like the child needs to be assessed for special education. And then again, decide what's important to even share in that referral that you write up. So for instance, you may think that the child is impacted by traumatic experiences, and that's impacting the child's ability to learn because the child is dysregulated at school. So that's stuff you might want to share even in the referral. And you can also even explain that there are gaps in your historical knowledge, because there really could be gaps for this population. Another thing to note is that all standardized assessments, regardless if the assessment is filled out by a parent or teacher, the results need to be interpreted and generalized with caution, because identified behaviors reflect the respondent's familiarity with the student. Again, there might not be much familiarity. The student may be new to the school or has changed schools several times. And depending on the teacher or even our tolerance for behavioral problems, could impact the way some of these standardized assessments are filled out. So you can tell the professional doing this, that is doing the assessment, that your observation period is limited and not representative of a longer period of time. So maybe offer narratives as alternatives, and ask about the use of other measures that might better fit the circumstances. Also note that older children and youth will be given assessments as well, and those answers may also be dependent on the child's sense of safety and stability. So for instance, if the child recently joined your family, that might impact the way that child answers questions. So talking about culturally sensitive assessments, I think is really important, because, well, first of all, assessments should be culturally sensitive, and the school or assessor should be writing assessments that are culturally sensitive. But, you know, you may be white or a different culture or race than the parent, than the student or the child that you're raising. So this might not have been something that you've had to think about in the past. The fact that the child is a minority. So share cultural information with the school before testing, so the testers can be prepared, or you can have a comfort level that they are going to be culturally sensitive when doing assessments, which is also going to make the assessment more trauma informed. So for instance, in certain cultures, making eye contact is not considered to be polite, especially for youth. A tester may interpret that lack of eye contact as being uninterested or rude or developmentally inappropriate, but really it is appropriate for that child's culture. And also building a trusting relationship with a student of color or a different culture may take more time for a tester. A Black student may be just distrustful of a white tester due to past experiences. And depending on the age of the student, you know, playing games or doing icebreakers could make the testing results more accurate, because the child will feel more comfortable. So just remind the school that you expect that these tests are going to be culturally sensitive. And also just other things that maybe, sorry, my son is calling me, so it's sort of bad timing because he's at rugby practice, sorry. I'll just hope he got picked up from school. So sorry, so remind the school to be mindful of different things, like even how close the tester sits to the student based on gender dynamics, because that may be something that's important in the student's birth culture. You know, maybe men and women are separated and that's what that child is used to, but this is a new environment. So just try and think about things in advance, or seek help from people from your child's culture, and that could help as well. So family and school collaboration. What is the family's role in communicating with the school? Ask questions about what information will be shared with other professionals such as teachers, school counselors, social workers, and psychologists when talking to the school personnel, so you can make informed decisions about what to share. You can make a colorful one-pager that works for your child, and include your contact information. And we have a template in guessing, Kelly, you put it in the chat box there.
I did not put it in the chat box yet, but I can when we conclude, and we can definitely make sure you get it in the follow-up emails, if nothing else.
Okay, so it's really good. And also consider signing releases that allow school-based clinicians to communicate with outside treatment providers to ensure consistent and coordinated an approach. So again, sometimes these professionals have a longer relationship than you may have with the child, and they're a good source of information for you and for the school. And then again, school family collaboration and sharing. So things that you might want to share that you may not think of it off the top of your head. So interventions that have and have not worked in the past. So things that you know have worked or not worked in the past, things that other professionals have told you or other foster families. Information from previous schools. The child may have gone to several schools. So gathering information is always really helpful. Copies of private reports, such as maybe other testing that's been done outside of the school, private therapy history, and even hospitalizations, custody concerns, important dates, anniversaries of an event or death, events that may be stressful, upcoming court dates, visiting family, because these could all be triggers for a child who has a history with trauma, and changes in mood, behaviors, and relationships, which are all pretty much dependent on what's happening with the child at any given time. So other things that you can think about that maybe you wouldn't think about off the top of your mind are just emergency contact information. So be really thoughtful about who's listed on your child's emergency care card. Make sure that it's a safe person and well known to your child. And that can be helpful in the event of a crisis, and let the child know who is on the emergency card as well. Provide all available phone numbers for contacts. Provide your email address to facilitate ongoing contact. Update emergency cards as soon as possible if there's a change in contact information, such as custody changes, change in emergency contacts, move, change in phone number or email. And then Kelly's gonna talk about independent educational evaluations.
Thanks, Beth. So Beth did a really deep dive in the socio-cultural piece of the evaluation, and I have mentioned very briefly some of the other components of the evaluation. It is important to know, and this is obvious something that's not often shared freely, but it is a right under your procedural safeguards under the IDEA regulations, that if parents, again, whoever's acting as parent, disagree with the test that's being given during their child's evaluation process, in other words, a test that's given by the school, you have a right to request an independent educational evaluation. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as an IEE, conducted by a qualified person who does not work for the school. So that's the independent aspect of it. And families do not need to pay for that. So it is a really important option, especially with our kiddos who have had challenging histories, and or we believe that the way that the test was administered was not valid or an accurate representation of their need. It is really important to exercise your right to an IEE. This is covered a lot more in one of the earlier webinars, or you're always welcome to call us to learn more. So I'm just going to quickly go into eligibility. Again, covered fairly in depth in earlier webinars, but specifically for foster, adoptive, and kinship, there's a couple things that are important to know about. So again, around the circle, we've gotten through referral, we've gotten through evaluation, all that data is collected, the team comes together, and they must then determine, for a child to be able to receive special education related services, they must determine a category, at least one category, under which they are eligible as a child with a disability for IDA purposes. These are the categories. And I've mentioned before that that's sometimes a really uncomfortable thing for folks that are novice to this process, the idea that we are reducing our child to a label so that they can get through this door of special education eligibility and get the services they need. And yes, no argument here. It is a challenge, but it is the way the system works. So it is important to understand that piece. So when you're thinking about your child, particularly if they have not been in your care for their entire life, it is really important to think about what these categories mean, understand deeply the eligibility criteria, and understand conditions that may make these applicable, or conditions or circumstances that may not make them eligible, or relevant for your child. So we do see a lot of foster adoptive and kinship families struggle with the identification, but there are some commonalities in categories. So some of the most common, I would say, amongst our formed families is developmental delay for our young ones, emotional disability, other health impairment, which is often where we will find diagnoses of ADHD and related conditions, and learning disability. So I would say those five are the ones that we see most often. That does not mean that children are not identified under other categories. Autism is a category that's really sort of exploded in the last 15, 10 years. So we do see some some families working under that category, but those are the ones we're going to talk, and we're going to talk more specifically about ED in a moment, because that is a very, very common category for kids who have been through especially really challenging uh, social emotional trauma histories and maybe exhibiting some really challenging behaviors. So there is a document, and that is in the handouts pod. I failed to mention the handouts pod. There's a pod on the right. It says handouts, and there's two things in there right now. There's the copy of the slides that you're looking at, because there's a lot of information there, I know, so you can take those and look at them at your leisure. The other document is this supplemental guidance document that just came out from the Virginia Department of Education last year. And it is a really helpful document. It's a little thick, but it is very helpful in helping the team, of which parents and caregivers are a part, understand more details about the nature of these categories and how evaluation should be conducted to begin with. And this comes straight from there. I want you to recognize that while this is not regulations, it is guidance from a state Department of Education, and it holds some weight. So I think it's important for you to become familiar with this document if you're struggling to get your child the services that they need. Notice that there's a whole list. I did not include the whole list, but there's some examples of differences that may impact a student's learning and engagement in school. And they include a variety of things, but they, in particular, and relevant to many of our families, exposure to trauma. So it is important. That doesn't mean just because a child has been exposed to trauma that they immediately are eligible for one of these categories. It means that it is an example in a state document that says it is a valid question to ask. It's a valid examination that the team needs to make. What are the cultural, linguistic, social, economic differences? And that may include exposure to trauma, and that must be considered by the team. Other language, and this I just copied verbatim. I know that's a lot of words, but I highlighted a few there that I think may be important. They actually have a whole section on trauma, exposure to trauma in this new guidance, which is new. This is new practice for VDOE. And you can see there that there's an acknowledgement that trauma can impact the brain, that can impact developmental stage. It can present like other conditions, and there may be a range of responses in a child who's been exposed to trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and trauma and toxic stress. So this is helpful potentially if you are trying to advocate on behalf of a child who has trauma histories, and there may be some I don't see pushback, but maybe some resistance on the part of the team in recognizing the impact of that trauma in terms of eligibility for services. So I just leave that with you and maybe helpful for you to keep handy. Want to talk, like I said, about that category of emotional disability for a moment. It is a common category, particularly for our children in foster adoptive kinship care. And gonna just share a little bit of what this guidance says about this category in particular. So it is important when a team is considering whether this child is a child with an emotional disability that there must be discussion of the child's cultural background. And note, the behaviors may be the result of trauma, communication differences, social maladjustment, and or an emotional disability. They're saying that those are things that may contribute to behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean just, again, because they had trauma or communication, they're just saying that relates potentially to the behavior of the child. So when you're determining an emotional disability, here are the things that the team must consider. And these are written in the federal regulations as well as the state special education regulations. So really important as the team thinks about whether emotional disability fits the description and the characteristics and the assessment data for your child. Are the behaviors appropriate in one environment? They may be considered inappropriate in another. So the team really has to consider, is the behavior that they're exhibiting perhaps an adaptive behavior in some environments? What's the function of the behavior? What's the need behind that behavior? What is that function of that behavior for that kid? Is there specialized instructional need? And then functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans are specifically written in there as tools to help determine whether that child has an emotional disability. So we're going to do a poll, and hopefully I won't mess it up this time, that you should be able to take now. And again, then you can mark more than one. So a child in your care or a child you've been working with, what are some of the categories that you have seen or considered and been identified with your kiddo? They're not all here. So if a category like autism, autism is listed. There's some others. Orthopedic impairments, for example, is not listed here. So if there are others, feel free to put those in the questions pod. Okay, I'm going to close it in 5 more seconds. And Beth, can you read those off to us? Can't tell if Beth's there. All right, I see that we have a very large representation of developmental delay, of emotional disability, and other health impairments. So yes, those are very common, so sort of consistent with what we've heard in the past. A little bit less so for learning disability. Looks like just 1 or 2 autism. And let me just check if there were anything chatted in. Ortho, okay, so an orthopedic impairment is definitely another category. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to try to hide that, and hopefully we return to the slides. And
One more.
all right, and so we're moving around the circle. We're not going to spend a lot of time in this session because the focus is eligibility and our time is really short on IEPs. I'm just going to tell you that there are some helpful hints in the handouts about collaborating and trying to really make that power balance work in a effective family and school partnership. So we know that trauma, particularly in foster adoptive kinship families, is a factor, and it is important. This is actually a document from the Kennedy Krieger Institute written for school personnel about what school personnel might want to do in working with families. So great document. It is in our website on our resources page under the trauma section. So it is a good document if you ever want to share it with have occasion to share it with your school colleagues. That's always a great idea to give them more tools. And there are some tools, excuse me, suggested practices within that document from Kennedy Krieger about what would be trauma-sensitive IEP practices. Just a reminder that we're always working for consensus. And I do want to give folks a little bit of time, so I'm going to skip over those tips. Well, actually, let me just make sure that the gist of those tips is that it's really important to know who's on your child's team. Really consider them a team designed to support you and your child. There may be a couple go-to people that you develop strong relationships with. It may be a special ed case manager. It may be the social worker at the school. Maybe a counselor or psychologist that really is somebody who gets the mental health piece or the trauma piece. That could be a go-to person for you and could be sort of a liaison for you. Reinforcement works with kids, and it works with adults sometimes as well. So, really strengthening and thinking of your half of that partnership with the school folks as an important consideration. So don't just come to the school folks when you have a concern or an issue, just like you don't want them to come to you only when they're having a problem with your child. So, use those good positive reinforcement skills when you're working with the staff. And then finally, just really know a lot about your child's educational environment so that you're always sort of able to monitor and measure that situation. I think Beth's going to sort of, as we talk through these questions, put some links in the chat box, including an evaluation for this session. So please do complete the evaluation. It's really important to us. There are a couple other resources in there that are, again, in the handouts. And we do, again, beg your indulgence in completing the evaluation. And we also encourage you to follow us on Facebook, on Instagram. We have a Twitter account, and everything and more is on our website. We have so many resources. There's a whole trauma section under our resources page. I'm going to go to the questions because there's a lot, which is great. I am so excited to see them. Okay, so Foster, okay, so this was a question that came in, and this is not an uncommon situation, and I'm just going to tell you what's supposed to happen. And I don't doubt that what you've experienced is happening. So I have a foster child who's in the process of being found eligible for special education. The Department of Social Services would not allow me to sign documents during the process as a parent. Was that allowed on their end? The guardian ad litem said that it could not be me as TPR had not been completed. TPR is termination of parental rights. So again, not knowing exactly what the status of the birth parent or the parent was in terms of whether they were just refusing to participate or they were unavailable. If they were participating, then obviously they would indeed serve as the parent in terms of signing consent and that doesn't exclude a foster parent from participating, but if they are involved, they are the one who provides that consent. It should not be a caseworker. So I'm not, unless again, the court has been involved and designated them as the educational decision maker. So I can only say that from the very brief description, it doesn't sound like that was the way the regulations would indicate it should go. So I'm sorry about that. But, and again, you contact us anytime and we can talk through a specific situation. Another question about qualifying with a private neuropsych evaluation. And so that a neuropsychological is a detailed, comprehensive evaluation that is often done by a neuropsychologist or a neurologist and a psychologist with special focus on the neurology of learning, the neurology of disorder, disability. And so the answer is sort of. Yes, the qualification is determined by the eligibility team, of which the parent family member is a part. So one of their duties is to look at the present level of performance and say, what data is available now? What additional data do we need to collect? And then we make the decision, looking at all of that data, we make a decision about whether the child meets the eligibility criteria. So if you come hand in hand with the private neuropsych saying, look, we got this for you, their team still needs to look that over, look at how recent it was, look at if it meets those criteria of what is an appropriate evaluation, and say, yes, we need additional data to be collected by the school, or no, we have enough and we want to move forward. It can be done with data that was pre-existing, but the team is ultimately the one that makes that decision. Okay, next question. As foster parents, do we have the right to provide the school with past hospitalization records, therapy reports, specific abuse information with schools, et cetera, as it relates to the social cultural evaluation? I believe you do, unless there's some reason that the DSS is protecting that data for safety reasons for the child's well-being. I don't know exactly what that would be, but you know, they may have a reason, and that reason should be shared with you, of why certain data would not be appropriate to be shared for a security reason. But otherwise, if you have access to those records and they have educational potential, educational impact or implication, I don't think you should have, I don't know that there's a reason you could not share them. Again, not speaking about an individual situation, but just generally. Unique implications with multiple disability category. Okay, so multiple disability category is one of those categories. I'll go back to that list. Oh, and I see we have 2 minutes. So again, I encourage you to complete the evaluation. Beth, did we get that in the chat box?
It is in the chat box, but I think it might just be you. I don't know if anyone else can see it other than you because of the settings on the settings that are I can only send to presenter or panelist. That's just my only option.
Oh, that's a problem.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so I was going to stop you and let you know that I don't think anyone can see this.
Okay, what I will do is, did I stop the screen share?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and paste all of this good stuff in the box. Apologies, we've got setting issues.
So I pasted it. I don't know if you can use it. I think you can't. So at least the evaluation.
Yeah, we'll definitely get the evaluation in there. And then, so that's the evaluation. Is everybody seeing that in the chat box? And what we'll do is I will make sure that Lisa on our staff sends you the full list of all of the links for the Spring Forward, for the
Learning your way.
learning your way, everything we talked about that we've hopefully tempted you with and you can't live without. So let me go back to sharing and answer this question. And I understand if you have to slip away, and if you need you need a certificate of attendance, remember you can email us at info@formfamiliesforward. So this is the list of those categories, and multiple disabilities is one of them. What that essentially is meeting more than one of the categories. So the child would be eligible for more than one of those categories, and then they would say yes, if they have more than one, and there's implications for their educational performance and all of those, then they could meet the multiple disability category. I don't know that I can name exactly any negative or positive implication of that category, at least up here in Northern Virginia. Possibly, in this case, the person asking the question indicated their child had been categorized as having an orthopedic impairment, and then I assume another category was identified in addition to orthopedic impairment, and then the multiple disability category was identified. It's possible that the school is doing that for staffing reasons, that category may result in their internal staffing with a higher ratio of staff. So in other words, more intensive services. So that may be why they're doing that. There's no reason under the way the regs are that would prevent your child once the child has eligibility under any category, they're sort of through that door. And then it's really about the IEP and setting the goals and identifying the services and accommodations within and the level of service within the IEP. So I hope that. And this next question is for Beth, which is great. I think that might wrap us up for the night. I'm struggling with how much to disclose for a child record, how much to disclose for a school record. For instance, if a child is diagnosed with PTSD, I would disclose that. Would it be helpful for educational purposes for the school to know the trauma is prolonged sexual abuse, or even further if it was a sexual abuse ring, such as prostitution of a young child? Beth?
So what I would say is if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can talk about specifically maybe what triggers the child. Personally, I did work at the schools, and I don't think there's any downside for giving that information because it is private. And I think it might help as far as like being very mindful of like spatial and touching and things that could really trigger the child. But I also think you can do the same thing without giving the specifics if you're more comfortable with that, by just saying, being clear that your child needs personal space if that's the case, and whatever you think makes your child uncomfortable is what I would say. So I think you could go either way, but in general, I really think that this stuff is really kept private. So I don't know if Kelly has a different, I think you can handle it either way, but I think it generally is really kept private. I haven't really heard of many instances where, in fact, really any, where this information was misused.
Yeah, I think the Beth, the focus, of course, of the whole purpose of the sharing is that it's important for them to know because it has some sort of educational implication. Maybe they can't be in certain environments or shouldn't be in certain environments. Maybe they need a higher level of supervision. Maybe they need, advanced notice for certain things that are going to happen or certain circumstances that might come their way. So you could just broadly speak to that, but often, to Beth's point, helping the staff understand the specific nature may be appropriate. So I don't, there's not a definitive answer. I think you have to judge a little bit about based on what is that sharing of that information going to secure for your child. And there's
Yeah,
one last,
yeah.
sorry.
I was just gonna say, if the child is sexually acting out, if like then I would say in that case, I probably would definitively talk about the past trauma, because that will contextualize it for the school and make them very aware of you could talk about how to help the child and what to do in case that happens during school. So I would say that.
And one question or ask about prenatal exposure to substances considered trauma. Very likely, it is actually considered a traumatic brain injury. So it often does. Children, youth, and young adults who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, prenatal exposure to alcohol, often benefit greatly from trauma-informed practices. So those same conditions and circumstances and considerations for trauma-impacted kids should apply for your kiddo with substance exposure. All right, I think that's it. We have gone a few minutes over time. We appreciate everybody staying with us and appreciate you filling out that evaluation, and we will definitely send a follow-up with all of the links. Again, you have the handouts there in the pod, and we will put those online as well as soon as this recording is done. Thank you so much. We're so pleased you spent time with us, and we hope to see you next Tuesday for a final wrap up and speaking specifically to issues of identifying and serving children of military families in foster, adoptive, and kinship homes. All right. Be well. Take care.
Thank you.